the Black Bourgeoisie and Representation 2. How social mobility, or the Black elites, sold out Black culture for cannibalism, commodification, consumption, capitalism. Nat Turner was born on October 2, 1800, in Southampton County, Virginia, just a week before Gabriel Prosser was executed. From an early age, Turner displayed an uncanny ability to recount events that had occurred before his birth, and this, coupled with his sharp intellect and spiritual nature, led many in his community to see him as a prophet, destined for a greater purpose. He was deeply religious and often chose isolation over socializing, dedicating himself to fasting and prayer. In 1821, Turner escaped from his overseer, only to return after 30 days, guided by a vision in which a divine spirit instructed him to return to the service of my earthly master. Following his master Samuel Turner's death in 1822, Nat was sold to Thomas More. Over the next few years, Turner experienced more powerful visions. In one, he witnessed lights in the sky and later saw what seemed to be blood dripping on cornfields. He spoke of finding mysterious symbols and figures drawn in blood on leaves, resembling what he had seen in his visions. On May 12, 1828, Turner experienced another revelation. I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent, for the time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last should be first. This vision instructed him to wait for a sign from the heavens before rising against his oppressors. By 1830, Turner found himself under the household of Joseph Travis, husband of the widow of his former master. Although Travis was considered kind, Turner remained steadfast in his belief that he was chosen for a higher purpose. In February 1831, a solar eclipse appeared, Turner's anticipated sign. He shared his plans with his closest allies, Henry, Hark, Nelson, and Sam. Initially, they intended to start their uprising on July 4th, but illness forced them to delay. Another cosmic sign occurred on August 13th, when the sun took on a bluish-green hue, solidifying Turner's resolve. On August 21st, he and 6 followers gathered in the woods, shared a meal, and prepared to launch their insurrection. By 2 a.m., they headed to the Travis household, killing the entire family in their sleep, and then moved from house to house, targeting every white family they encountered. Turner's force soon grew to over 40 enslaved people, many on horseback, all united in their quest for freedom. On August 22nd, Turner decided to march toward Jerusalem, the nearest town. However, word of the rebellion had spread, and local militia confronted his group. The rebels dispersed, and by nightfall, Turner's forces were weakened. An attempted attack on another household ended in failure, and many of his men were captured. A final confrontation with state and federal troops ensued, resulting in one rebel's death while others, including Turner, managed to escape. In total, the uprising resulted in the deaths of at least 55 white people. For weeks, Turner hid near the Travis farm until he was finally captured on October 30th. While imprisoned, he dictated his confession to Dr. Thomas R. Gray. On November 5th, Nat Turner was tried and sentenced to death. He was executed on November 11th, and his body was skinned post-mortem. In the aftermath, Virginia executed 55 people, banished others, and reimbursed slaveholders for their losses. Fear and hysteria spread, and white mobs killed nearly 200 black people, many with no ties to the rebellion. The paranoia extended to North Carolina, where enslaved people were accused, tried, and executed for alleged connections to Turner's revolt. In response to this unprecedented uprising, Virginia's legislature debated abolishing slavery, but ultimately chose to maintain the institution, intensifying repression against both enslaved and free black people. After his capture, Turner was imprisoned and swiftly tried. On November 5, 1831, He was found guilty of conspiring to rebel and making insurrection. Just a few days later, on November 11th, Turner was hanged in a public execution, a final act intended to showcase the power of the oppressors and to instill fear within the enslaved. However, his execution was just the beginning of a chilling narrative that would symbolize not just his death, but the dismemberment of Black resistance itself. Turner's body was handed over to a group of local doctors who dissected it in a gruesome display of power and dehumanization. There were reports that his skin was flayed and used to create relics such as purses, while his flesh was boiled and rendered into grease. What remained of him was scattered or kept as grisly souvenirs. A body that once stood tall in defiance was now reduced to fragments, appropriated and devoured by the very system that sought to eradicate his spirit. His bones were said to have been distributed, his skull passed around as a trophy, and his blood, the lifeblood of a revolutionary, was quite literally consumed by those who had conquered him. This macabre act of cannibalism wasn't merely physical, it was cultural. It represented how the identity, spirit, and resistance of Black people were broken apart, consumed, and digested into the very fabric of an oppressive society that thrived on the destruction of their identity. Turner's body, once whole and defiant, was stripped down to its components, each piece taken as a token to signify dominance, a chilling reminder of how Black lives and bodies were treated as property, as things to be owned, destroyed, and consumed. As the echoes of Turner's rebellion were gradually silenced, the act of devouring his remains took on a greater, more insidious meaning. It signified how the revolutionary spirit could be fragmented, how Black culture and resistance were forcefully absorbed and appropriated by those who sought to dismantle it. This process mirrors the fragmentation and cannibalization of Black culture over centuries, as pieces of identity, history, and resistance have been taken, distorted, and assimilated into the dominant culture, leaving behind a distorted and incomplete image. Nat Turner's fate serves as a stark and haunting allegory. Even in death, his body became a battleground, not just for control, but for narrative, for meaning. His remains, taken as grotesque souvenirs, reflected the relentless desire to consume Black resistance, to strip it of its power and meaning, to render it harmless and digestible within a society built on the bones of the oppressed. The exact number of Black slave owners in the United States varied over time and across regions, but estimates suggest there were several thousand Black slave owners during the peak of the practice in the early to mid-19th century. According to the 1830 U.S. Census, around 3,775 free Black individuals owned approximately 12,760 slaves across the country. Many Black slave owners and free Black individuals feared that the uprising would provoke violent reprisals, not just against those involved in the rebellion, but against all Black people, regardless of their status. They recognized that Turner's actions had the potential to bring down harsh collective punishment and increased scrutiny from white society on both enslaved and free Black people alike. As free Black elites, many of whom were property owners and business people, they had much to lose if the white population responded with blanket violence or more restrictive laws. This fear was well-founded, as following the rebellion, white mobs killed free and enslaved Black individuals indiscriminately, and new laws were passed to limit the freedoms of Black people, including curtailing their ability to assemble, preach, or travel. What have the Black elites truly done for the Black nation outside of symbolic gestures? There's been no effort of Black restoration despite having the influence and power to make changes. They have the power, influence, etc. to cause changes, but they don't. Look at what the BPP did with so little. They got their bag and basically said, "Fuck Black America," while profiting from it. In fact, they got the bag and sold you out. This raises questions, though. If because someone is Black influential and have the resources and power to step into those roles, should they automatically be expected to do so and champion the Black power efforts? I think it is wrong to expect this, however, my problem comes when divestment theory is added. They divest from the community and give the example while profiting from the community, and Black people still even playing into themes of Black empowerment while simultaneously divesting. This mentality had always been prevalent amongst the Black bourgeoisie. Why not sponsor Black banks or markets, centralizing Black power? Why has the dispersion been so fragmented since the 1970s? They do it to gather social support, but look what happens to each platform. They are either sold out or bought out by interest groups from other cultures. What forces are at play that causes this within the Black psyche? This is an example of the intersection between the strong forces of double consciousness, the forces of the American ethos of capitalism and consumption, of individualism, coupling with the strong effects of racism versus the collective struggle and spirit that is at the heart of Black America. The "fuck you, I got mines, hope you can get it too" serves as an example. We hear it often, "fuck these niggas." Black individualism is fueled by the sentiment of "fuck it, I'll play the bad guy." It's a minstrel show that still has the same themes of minstrel comedy tropes, taking advantage of white voyeurs' undying need to consume Black people, one's desire to take advantage of the social mobility and rise above one's station to go from rags to riches at the expense of playing into stereotypes for white consumption is understandable. As these are deviations from the mean, I ask them, at what cost? Self-empowerment? You stand on a pile of bones of denigrated flesh that stains the land. You participate in white supremacy in the form of animating their caricatures. You're not playing them or yourself, but your own nation. We exist in a state of suspended animation as the culture and the trauma we have inherited stems from the culture that was forged in response to racial occupation. The freedmen and Creole slavers participated in the occupier system, even though they were peripheral to it. We can examine some of these people, which can add an extra layer of dimension of complexity to the whitewashed Civil War, where we see it as binary, when in fact there would have been Black slavers who owned white slaves. William Ellison was born as April Ellison in 1790 in South Carolina and was enslaved from birth. He was of African descent. As a teenager, he was apprenticed to a white cotton gin maker, William McCrate, who taught him the skills that would later define his success. By 1816, Ellison was granted his freedom, though the details of how he managed to buy or secure it are unclear. After gaining his freedom, he changed his name to William Ellison, taking on the surname of his former owner, a common practice among freedmen. Ellison began his journey as a free man by establishing a cotton gin business, using the skills he had mastered. He became quite successful, and over time, he transitioned into a full-fledged planter, purchasing land and eventually slaves. By the time of the Civil War, Ellison owned more than 1,000 acres of land and around 60 slaves, making him one of the largest Black slave owners in South Carolina. He married Matilda Ellison, who was also a free woman of color. Together they had several children who later became involved in their father's business. Despite his status as a free Black man, William Ellison fully participated in the institution of slavery, supporting the Confederacy during the Civil War. His family was financially successful, but his ownership of slaves and support for the Confederacy made him a controversial figure, even among other free Blacks. Antoine Dubuclet was born in 1810 in Louisiana to a Creole family of color of mixed African, European, and possibly Native American ancestry. He inherited his wealth from his father, a free Black man who owned a sugar plantation. This made Antoine Dubuclet one of the few free Black men born into a wealthy and slave-owning family. After taking over the family business, Dubuclet expanded the plantation, acquiring more land and slaves, eventually owning over 100 slaves by 1860. He married Claire Pollard, a free woman of color, and after her death, he married Susan Brown. His marriages were advantageous, helping him maintain and grow his wealth. Dubuclet was highly successful, and became one of the wealthiest men, black or white, in Louisiana. After the Civil War, despite losing a significant part of his wealth, he was able to rebuild and enter politics, serving as the state treasurer of Louisiana during Reconstruction. Cyprien Ricard was born into a wealthy Creole family of mixed African, French, and possibly Native American descent in Louisiana. His father, Pierre Ricard, was a free man of color who became a successful plantation owner, which allowed Cyprien to inherit both wealth and status. After taking over the plantation, Cyprien expanded it, and by the 1850s, he owned more than 90 slaves, making him one of the larger black slaveholders in Louisiana. Little is known about his personal life or whether he married, but his success as a planter and slave owner was notable. He was able to maintain his wealth and status even in a society that often limited opportunities for free people of color. Justice Angel's early life is not well documented, but he was a free black man living in South Carolina, most likely of African descent. He was one of the few free black individuals who managed to accumulate considerable wealth, eventually owning 84 slaves by 1830, making him one of the largest black slaveholders in the state. It is unclear how Angel became a slave owner, or whether he was born free or formerly enslaved. There is little information about his family or marital status, but he was a successful slave owner by the standards of the time. Marie-Thérèse Metoyer, known as Coin Coin, was born enslaved in Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, around 1742. She was of African descent with likely some French ancestry. She became the mistress of a French merchant, Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer, and bore him several children. Despite being enslaved, she gained her freedom in the late 18th century. Using her knowledge of herbal medicine and agriculture, she began acquiring land, and over time, amassed significant wealth. Marie started with small tracts of land and eventually established the Melrose Plantation. As a free woman, she became a slave owner, using enslaved labor to work her growing plantation. Her children, who were also free, inherited her entrepreneurial spirit and expanded the family's holdings, with the Metoyer family collectively owning over 200 slaves at their peak. Marie was considered highly successful, and her legacy continued through her descendants, who maintained the family's wealth and status in the Creole community of Louisiana. Andrew Durnford was born in New Orleans in 1800 to a free black mother and a white French father, making him of mixed African and French descent. His father played a significant role in helping him establish himself as a successful sugar planter. He began his career with a land grant from his father and slowly expanded his holdings. By the 1840s, he owned a large sugar plantation with several dozen slaves. Durnford was considered part of the Creole elite in Louisiana and developed a reputation as a competent and successful businessman. He married a woman named Rosalie, and they had children, though his wife played a less public role in his business affairs. Andrew Durnford had strong connections with other influential figures in Louisiana, and despite the racial barriers of the time, he managed to thrive as a slave owner and respected member of the plantation-owning class. These individuals represent the complexities and contradictions of free black slave owners in the antebellum South. Most notably, I think, would be the complex story of Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was one of the first prominent black landowners in colonial Virginia and is often recognized as one of the earliest black slaveholders in what would become the United States. Born in Angola in the late 16th or early 17th century, Johnson was captured by Portuguese slave traders and eventually brought to the English colony of Virginia in 1621, where he was sold as an indentured servant, not as a lifelong slave, which was typical of the time. Johnson worked on a tobacco plantation owned by a man named Bennett and was listed as Antonio a Negro in early records. After serving his indenture, which usually lasted 7 to 9 years, he gained his freedom. As a free man, he took the name Anthony Johnson and began to accumulate wealth, something that was still possible in the early years of the Virginia colony, when racial lines were not as rigidly defined. By the 1640s, Johnson had become a successful farmer, acquiring a sizable amount of land, 250 acres, through the headright system, which granted land to settlers who paid for the passage of indentured servants to the colony. This was significant because it showed that Johnson had the means to participate in a system designed to reward landowners and increase their labor force. In the 1650s, Anthony Johnson acquired 5 indentured servants of his own, one of whom was John Casor, another black man. A dispute arose when Casor claimed that he had served his term of indenture and should be released. Johnson argued that Casor was his slave for life. The case went to court in 1655, where the Virginia court ruled in Johnson's favor, making John Casor one of the first people legally declared a slave for life in the English colonies, and marking one of the earliest instances of legalized lifelong slavery in what would become the United States. This case contributed to the gradual shift from a system of indentured servitude to a system of racialized, hereditary slavery. Anthony Johnson was married to a woman named Mary, who is also believed to have been an indentured servant. The couple had at least 4 children, 2 sons, Richard and John, and 2 daughters. Together, the Johnson family became successful landowners, with Anthony even managing to acquire 250 additional acres of land. They established themselves as one of the wealthier free black families in early colonial Virginia, which was a remarkable achievement given the evolving racial and legal restrictions of the time. In the later years of his life, Johnson and his family moved to Maryland, where they leased a large tract of land. After Anthony Johnson's death in 1670, a Virginia court ruled that his land could be seized by the colony because he was considered an alien despite being a free man. This decision reflected the growing racial distinctions and the shift toward a society based on rigid racial hierarchy and lifelong slavery. The Johnson family's story shows how black individuals could, at one point, navigate the early colonial system, but it also demonstrates how quickly the laws and society changed to restrict the freedoms and rights of people of Negro descent. Never forget the black bourgeois places class above all else. Never forget the collaborators, horizontal and vertical, the divestors, and others that enabled the continuation of the social order. Know truly that the Jay-Z and Beyoncé brands would have owned, participated, and traded slaves if this was 1619.